Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
After these matters, God tested Abraham. Achar hadvarim ha'ela v'ha'elohim nisa et Avraham. Why does God test? Who benefits from a divine test? Generally, in testing, there are two possibilities as to who is the beneficiary. It can either be the tester or the tested. But why is God administering the test? Although a straightforward reading of the text may suggest it, generally, very few of the traditional commentators were willing to accept that God learned something from testing Abraham. But did Abraham benefit from the Akedah? This doesn't seem like a promising direction either. So in early 10th century Baghdad, Rav Saadia Gaon suggested a different approach. The beneficiary was neither God nor Abraham, but rather the audience. Saadia was a fascinating character, a brilliant man. He was born in Egypt, spent time in Palestine, and then became the only foreign-born Jew to lead one of the great Babylonian Jewish yeshivot when he became the Gaon, the head of the Academy of Shira. His suggestion here had already a long history of interpretation in the Akedah. Already 1,000 years earlier, the book of Jubilees translated God's pronouncement, "Now I know," as "now I have made known," emphasizing that the point of the trial was to demonstrate Abraham's great devotion to others. And similar ideas to this can be found in the Midrash. But some of Saadia's medieval followers were less impressed. A century and a half later, the great Spanish polymath, Abraham Ibn Ezra, who wrote his commentary on the Torah while in Italy, objected. The language he uses is, "V'halo yadaze hagaon, ki be'et she'akad et beno, lo hayu sham afilu ne'arav." But sure, Saadia knows that at the moment that Abraham bound his son, there was no one there, not even his attendants. This does seem like an important observation. Abraham is well known, certainly in the Midrash, as the great teacher of monotheism, the great proselytizer, the one who taught the people the difference between God worship and idol worship. The Torah refers to the souls which he made in Haran, and this is often taken to refer to the many people whom he persuaded the truth of, about the truth of the divine creator, Lord of the world. And yet here, at this most sublime moment in his religious life, Abraham teaches no one. The Akedah is performed the way the US Open was performed in 2020, with no spectators. By way of contrast, think about Elijah on Mount Carmel. He gathers the whole nation for his demonstration of God's power and control. But Abraham is all alone. For some later commentators, this aloneness is intentional. The 19th century rabbi, Meir Leibush Visser, known as the Malbim, writes that Abraham wanted to be alone because now, for the first time, he did not understand why God would want him to do this. He had always taught the ethical nature of the divine will. So how could God command him to sacrifice his son? Abraham didn't understand, and so opted to follow God, but alone. In any event, says Ibn Ezra, this means that Saadia cannot be right. The Akedah cannot be for the benefit of the onlookers if there are no onlookers. But this view was revived in the following century. Maimonides and then Rabbi David Kimchi argued that there is, in fact, an audience, just not a live audience. There is a literary audience. In other words, us. Right? We are the audience. We readers are the reason the story exists. Rabbi Kimchi, better known as the Radak, even points out that this is not just for the readers of the Jewish Bible. As he says, "V'hayom kama shanim miyom shebatla avodat hatzlamim v'ha'elilim ma'aminim rov ha'olam b'torat Moshe Rabbeinu u'b'sipureha. Ub'ha'amin rov b'nei ha'olam ha'sipur ha'gadol hazeh hu edut gdola al Avraham Avinu shahaya ohev ha'el ahava shlema v'tama v'ra'oi la'adam l'lmod himenu derech ahavato." And today, his language is, it's been a long time since the abolishment of idolatry, and most of the world believes in the Torah of Moses and its narratives. And since most of humanity believes in this great story, it constitutes great testimony about our father Abraham, that he loved God with a complete and perfect love, and that people should learn from him how to love. Radak's world consisted of Jews and Christians and perhaps also Muslims, as the story of the Akedah appears also in the Quran. Maimonides is less specific about the audience, but more specific about the lessons to be learned. In his great philosophical work, Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides raises the question of the purpose of tests in general, and of the Akedah in particular. And he says that the story teaches us two specific lessons. First, it teaches that the obligation to love and fear God is in fact limitless. Most commandments come with built-in limitations. For a positive commandment, there is a limit as to how much money one is to spend. For a negative commandment, there is also a limit. One not need die to avoid transgressing a particular sin. But the Akedah teaches that if the love of God is demanded, this has no limits, even to the sacrifice of one's child. Second, it teaches something about prophecy. It teaches, says Maimonides, that a prophet always experiences prophecy as 100% clear and certain. The Akedah teaches this because otherwise Abraham would have doubted. Kant, much later, argued that Abraham, in fact, should have doubted. And in the language of Kant, for if God should really speak to a human being, the latter could still never know that it was God speaking. It is quite impossible for a human being to apprehend the infinite by his senses, distinguish it from sensible beings, and be acquainted with it as such. But in some cases, the human being can be sure that the voice he hears is not God's. For if the voice commands him to do something contrary to moral law, then no matter how majestic the apparition may be, and no matter how it may seem to surpass the whole of nature, he must consider it an illusion. We can use, Kant continues, as an example, the myth of the sacrifice that Abraham was going to make by butchering and burning his only son at God's command. The poor child, without knowing it, even brought the wood for the fire. Abraham should have replied to this supposedly divine voice, that I ought not kill my good son is quite certain, but that you, this apparition, are God, of that I am not certain, and never can be, not even if this voice rings down to me from visible heaven. But for Maimonides, Abraham could not have said, of that I am not certain. On the contrary, the very fact that he picked up his knife and walked to the mountain shows that he was certain. In any event, this is the view, Saadia, Maimonides, and Radak, that the test is primarily not for the tested or the tester, but for a third party, the audience, who stands in awe of Abraham and learns from him. In the 13th century, a new idea was introduced. Maybe the test was for Abraham's benefit after all. This is proposed by Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, Nachmanides, who argues that while Abraham may have already been a nearly perfect worshiper of God before the Akedah, this was only in principle. In practice, he had not been fully tested, and one cannot get reward only for potential. Since God wanted to give Abraham reward for his traits, he had to put it into practice. As Nachmanides puts it, Aval ha-minaseh yitbarach yitzavebo lehotzi hadavar min hakoach el hapoal, lehiyot lo schar ma'aseh tov, lo schar lev tov bilvad. The tester, may he be blessed, commands him to bring something from the potential to the actual, so that he may enjoy the rewards of a good deed, not just the rewards of a good heart. Any educator knows that a good test is not just a diagnostic, but also an educational opportunity in and of itself. A student should emerge from the test with a deeper appreciation of the material than when they went in. But the Ramban leaves this on the almost technical level of reward. It was left to yet a later commentator, Rabbi Nisim of Gerona of the 14th century, to develop this in a more meaningful direction. In his commentary on Genesis, which ends after chapter 22, he cites Maimonides and he cites Nachmanides, and then he says he has something to add. And what he adds is quite powerful. He says that actualizing potential is never just a matter of taking what was always present and bringing it out into the open, because a person's potential is never really known until they are tested. Think of the athlete who is always asked to run faster, throw harder, shoot better, serve with more precision than she ever has before. Right? Your best throw is 80 miles per hour. Can you get it to 82, 85? The one being tested pushes harder and emerges stronger from the trial. And so too, says Rabbi Nissim, in one's faith and religion. Abraham was extraordinary, but each of the 10 trials that he underwent pushed him a little harder, a little higher. So each time he rose a bit in his devotion and dedication. Each test was not just to find something out, but to help Abraham grow spiritually. In general, Rabbi Nissim says, the Torah doesn't push too hard. Not everyone thrives under test conditions, so the Torah sets a reasonable bar and lets everyone stay there. But there are special people, Abraham among them, whom God wants to push as hard as possible because they can truly ascend to remarkable heights. After the Akedah, God called it off. 10 tests was enough. And this last one in particular was as far as Abraham and maybe any human being could go. To summarize then, there are two dominant views of the purposes of tests in the Bible and of the Akedah in particular. One camp sees it as benefiting the audience, in this case, the literary audience, and the other sees the beneficiary as the one who is tested. Either way, tests are profound moments and opportunities for personal growth and reflection.